I am so happy to be here today with Ira again. Ira has been a frequent guest on the channel in the past, and I will post some of the previous conversations in the description so that people can kind of catch up on who you are and how you got involved in this corner of the internet. Most recently, Ira contacted me after watching the episode that I did with Brad regarding measurement. And Ira has some ideas that he'd like to talk to me about regarding measurement. And interestingly, Ira, you were one of three people that contacted me after that video and said, I want to talk about this. So it's obviously a big question. And,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I'm eager to talk some more about it. So what do you
Well,
have?
thanks again, Karen. You're right. I've been watching your channel now for I don't know how many years now. I don't know when you first started it,
3 years, yeah.
3 years. And what's interesting to me also is it was maybe about a year ago. It seemed like you really thought, well, what am I doing with this channel?
Yeah.
And you look now over the past year of the conversations you've had, and they're really something special. They're unique, I would say. Uh, One of them is you've brought people together to speak about things that I'm sure would never have crossed paths. And I think that's really been special. One example, I think, but there have been several, but when you had Wolfgang Smith with John Vervaeke, and Wolfgang Smith's this older guy, right? And it's kind of a blank thing to look at his face. But to me, when Vervaeke started talking about Neoplatonism, it's almost like, at least in his eyes, you could see a connection. And when somebody like that, I could imagine how isolated he must have been in his life. The way he was thinking so differently than the herd in his life. And I'll mention one other thing that I've heard on the channel that way. And that sense of a connection between people, I think for me, it was kind of uh, well, moving in a way, nice to see. Just to see people come together that way was really something. Another one you've had is, I never would have known of, I don't think I never heard of before, is all the things with Mike 11. And frankly, when you first pointed out Mike 11 to me, I don't know if it was me personally or was this on your channel, and I listened to a couple of his, scientific talks, I was kind of appalled by him. I mean, I just thought of this technocrat, Dr. Frankenstein, doing the, things that are really terrible or potentially terrible without any sense of what they could mean. And then when he came on your channel, it was totally flipped. I mean, here was this person with a real sense of philosophy, that he did understand what he was doing and he was trying to do it in the right way. And he said something, and one of the first times he said, I can't talk this way with my colleagues, which is something we really should be explored a lot with somebody like Levin and all the rest of them, because that's it. They don't think they can speak about the things, the humanity of what they're doing. So, that's something else has been there. And then I would say, coming from will be our talk today, so many of the people have been saying things. I think there is so much of those, also those, say, non-academic, not professional people who really have experience. Glenn obviously is one of those, and Brad is one of those that are doing things, are there working in the world, creating things, and thinking back philosophically about what they're doing and why. And I think, again, this is one of the problems with the academics, and they're not necessarily in the world dealing with it. And I think that's one of the reasons they go off on a tangent, which maybe we'll talk about today. Some of those types of things. So anyway, I want to congratulate you on your channel. I think it really, and I think you've grown so much too, I could say, in the sense of, I could see you, hear you putting things together in your own way and trying to get that out through these different guests. Not always, they obviously have their own tracks that they're used to being in, but I think even just getting the people together is that way. But I think I see you having your own interesting ideas as well. I mean, hold on one second, so I'll turn on the light. I can't see my notes. Um, so anyway, that's a little background, and then finally, I've had trouble also making comments on the Google, the YouTube. I don't know. I've had many, not just on your channel, so I was not good about making comments. And I think Brad's conversation I think I wrote you a note, was kind of triggered me. I said, okay, I finally got to say something in return back to you. And it's especially the sense because my background is as engineer as well as Brad's happens to be. And I think engineering is one of these, very different than a scientist, certainly a theoretical scientist, is that you have a fundamental feedback of whatever you're doing. At the end, it's got to work.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not the case for the scientists very often. And a lot of times scientists will do engineering, like they'll make devices and measurement techniques and other thing else. And essentially they're doing engineering. They need to measure something, say, they're doing engineering. But the work as a scientist, I've discovered something, it doesn't have to be true, even though they believe it, in terms of we can get back into that sense. But the engineer knows when something is working or not working, or eventually will. Things can fail at different times in different ways. So I think that's a different, worldview. Say back to Dallas Willard was the worldview talk that Paul played so many times, which I think was excellent. So in that sense, what I was going to do is, and I've made some notes based on your conversation with Brad, and say congratulations to Brad and you for an excellent conversation. So what I have is not at all a critique. It's almost kind of like an annotation. If I was there, I'd say, well, what about this? And here's something that maybe would add to what you guys had talked about. And a lot of this comes from in another life from now quite a long time ago. I was an engineering professor, and one of the courses I taught was on instrumentation. That included a lab. This is for engineering students about things you're supposed to know about taking measurements with. As an engineer or a mechanical engineer is mainly who I was teaching, is fundamental to what they're doing, is understanding how to take a measurement of various quantities, and then what happens with that measurement. So much about the different instances that Brad was talking about. So that's I guess the setup. We'll see how well
okay, well, so let me say just a couple things before we start. One is, thank you very much for your kind words about the direction of the channel in the last few months. I did make a big burst where I sat down and I thought about who would I like to get together. And we have an advantage, I think, not being in the silos that all these different people are in, because I have this beautiful YouTube where I can listen to all of these different people and their ideas, and then in my mind, they just sort of link up like blocks. Like I see what he's talking. I mean, the guy I'd like to really get in on this whole conversation.
I know. Let me say,
Wolfram. Yes.
Yeah.
Actually, I had a conversation yesterday with Perry Marshall of the Evolution 2.0 Prize. I don't know if you've heard of him.
No.
And it was a great conversation. He said he had just been in contact with Wolfram's people. And I said, oh, please, please. Put me in contact with Wolfram's people. I don't know if that will happen or not, but if it did, that would be great. Because I see what Wolfram is asking himself inside his head.
Yeah.
I know the answers that he wants. And I know the people who have the answers that he wants. But I myself am not articulate enough to explain it to him. I would have to bring these people together and get them to talk like Wolfgang did with John Vervaeke, and then watch the light bulbs go off.
Yeah, no,
I think love that. The other person I would like to get in, I would like Wolfram to talk to Jordan Peterson I think Jordan Peterson needs to talk to Wolfram. And speaking of Jordan Peterson, I was just listening to his talk this morning with Matthew Pajot that just dropped this morning, and they're talking about Matthew Pajot's book, The Language of Creation. And one of the things that Jordan said on that I thought was very pertinent to what we're going to be talking about. If you impose a final order on anything, if you impose a final judgment on anything, like a measurement, for example, you lose your connection to the transcendent. The minute you say, this is it, this is the perfect measurement, can't go any farther than this, now you've lost your connection to the transcendent. So that's why I think this conversation about measurement is so important. Not only the measurement, but the measurer, the observer. I was also listening to Paul Davies this morning, and he was talking about the observer. He was defining observer as whatever an observer is, it has to have internal states and a capacity to have a map of the outside world and a map of itself, which of course sounds very much like a human being, but I also think it's well, that's for another episode.
Yeah, well, I think maybe we'll get into a little bit of things like that. In other words, when I hear those descriptions, I was an academic, and well, it's interesting. And then the other hand is like, well, come on, don't keep going off theoretically. Can I observe something or not? Did my plane fly or didn't it? I once had a conversation, this was in a little different context, but with, getting into the sense of the postmodernist sense of then you can't measure anything, you can't know anything, because we're sitting at kind of a faculty little lounge or club. It's very simple, not kind of like leather chairs or anything, just a place where you can have a coffee. But there was an older man from Texan, a religion professor, so not your typical postmodernist, but we happened to sit down at the table and started talking. And because I was trying to teach something about these things to like a first year seminar. And he basically made the postmodern point about you can't know anything. And I guess my response at the spur of the moment was, well, did you think you know it? You certainly acted like you knew it, that chair was going to hold you up when you were going to sit down. And he sat there for, this pause. He's thinking about it, did you know that? And he said, no, I didn't know it. Well, maybe there is I don't know, we can get some psychological thing. We have so many conversations here over the last years about what you really understand and know versus not, what the brain's doing, what your perception is, and all the other things. But in terms of living in the world, he knew. He had enough experience. He knew what a chair was. He wasn't recognizing a wave function. And he sat down and he was sitting down. And so that's a little bit about some of the things maybe we can also talk about today.
Well, do you think that kind of know could be the same kind of, how do I put this? Trust comes to mind. It's trust, right?
Yeah.
I trust.
Somebody.
I trust that when I get on the airplane, it's going to fly somewhere.
Yeah.
I trust that when I flip the switch, the lights are going to come on. And there is a sense in which that kind of knowing is not that far off of the carnal knowledge knowing that's written about in the Bible, where the Adam and Eve knew each other.
Yeah.
So we have to have a way to know the world in order to interact in the world, right? So that doesn't necessarily mean that we understand every aspect of it, but we have to trust with as much of it as we can know that we can interact with it.
Somewhere it does. So that's, again, getting back to the combinatorial explosion or something of inaction. Human acts in the world. They think they know something. You'd only act if you think, if you have some idea purpose to what you're going to do. That's a
Yeah.
von Mises,
Yeah. Yep.
kind of look at it, which maybe brings me to my first little annotation or comment, and this goes in your video with Brad. So I'll just name some time points here if people ever want to go back. But you were talking about at 5 minutes 30 seconds about all measurements being a comparison, and how what we compare to and such. And I thought it was really interesting. I thought I want to talk to you about the aspect of the scale then of what those comparisons are. I think part of the problems we have in the modern world come from there's things that people are comparing that as human beings we have no sense for them at all. Say, what's the national debt, or something like that we could talk about. But in general, there's lots of things that just seem to be out of scale of what that would happen to mean, if these 10 to the 10th or 20th or whatever they happen to be. So going back to that, human scale, there's the foot, which obviously is a foot, and in French, that's a pied, that's a foot. And then there's the inch, which you talked about, you and Brad, and in French, that's a pouce. And, that's the pouce is a thumb.
Oh, okay.
Right. So those are obviously the human things that they're to scale there. And if we go now to the meter, which you talked about quite a bit, when I was in school, there are those ones based on the speed of sound. When I was in university, it was this wavelength based on the wavelength of krypton 26 or something like that. I mean, a particular krypton isotope that was set the wave, what a unit of measure that then could be expanded to say this was so many of those was a meter. But the history of the meter comes especially to the fore in the French Revolution. And there, there was this, and we'll come back to it from your conversation, a top-down describing of the world. Top-down describing of the calendar, a top-down describing of then what are distances. And they had a committee go out, and I forget exactly what where I've seen different histories of that, but some people try to do it by the circumference of the world, but I think they actually, took a team going from one French city to another and then dividing it up and saying this was a meter, and then making bars that were the standard, the way that Brad was talking about. And if I can do the screen, share screen, let me see if I can do this. And that, can you see the screen now?
I can see your screen. It's just a bunch of files.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think this is the history of the meter. Did I not find that picture? Hold on. Let me see if I can. Maybe. Here it is. Maybe. There it is. Here's a picture.
Okay, now I don't see it. You must be sharing your when it first comes up on screen share, it'll show you a bunch of different
boxes. I thought I chose my desktop, but let me see. Okay,
you chose your Explorer is what you chose, so I can see all your
File Explorer. I think okay, maybe it's this one. This one. Voila. How's that?
There you go. Okay.
So this is somewhere. There's 2 or 3 of these in Paris. I remember coming across one a few years ago, and going, there it is, and it's like on the wall. This is. Let me see if I can put this down. The meter. Where the exact address this is. I can't remember where the address was. There's one like in the center of Paris. I know, like on the left bank, like this, near the Sorbonne and things like that. So I don't know if you can see it, but there's a meter. That's like a meter length, that's on a wall. That's one of the ones they made up at that time. And it was
Now,
very top down.
is it a metal rod attached to that concrete, or is it
Yeah,
something
so
that?
it's on the, if you can see my pointer, my
Yeah.
mouse, it's, that's like the meter thing, and it's on the wall, and it was like a metal rod that they fixed. Now, Brad was getting at, when he changes temperature, humidity, you might change that, but that was their fixed thing. But I wanted to show you another image, is this one. Excuse me. That this is what they wanted to do to the French map. You see, like, these are the departments in France, they're rivers, they're mountains, they're all the things that make the reality of how people live. And what they want to do is, well, that's not very useful. Let's just make every size department exactly the same and make it a square. And they did this with the week. The week became like 10 days, I think, with only, 1 day off in 7 is too much. Let's make it 1 day off in 10. So totally inhuman. It's not based on people's, where they are, how they live, anything. Top down, we impose it, and it was unworkable. These things basically all failed. It did come through the meter. Actually, once you get into the SI units are easier in the sense of how they're all divisible by 10 and those kind of things. But still, people make a lot of mistakes because it's not physical. So you can be off on your measurement or off on your sense of what a measure is. And, some of these, there's some classic kind of engineering mistakes on things with units because they're not so easy to grasp, all the time. So anyway, the different definitions of the meter, they're in like Wikipedia. You can see them, and I'm not sure what's the official one. But the official one is like who says what the official one is. Now it's, there is these institutes of standards. They're kind of governmental things, and they impose them. I'm not sure of different ways if they've written a law about it, like they do for money. Like money can be bottom up as opposed to top down. And, which way is better? I would argue that most of the time, the bottom up is better. And we can get to that when you and Brad were talking about some different kind of standards that are in practice. So let me go to another time point there where Brad brought up at about 10 minutes a real nice example of essentially a displacement transducer. The device had an electrical internal signal that then gave out something that was proportional to the movement of the little plunger. That was very nice. And then goes to the sense of uncertainty in the measurement, and what that means. And I would try to teach it to try to understand what's uncertainty, because we get to like, what are some of the ways of understanding this uncertainty in a engineering sense or a mathematical sense, etc. But it amounts to something that I think is, as a human being, that you aren't sure of something. Like you might not be sure of a friend to be, reliable, and then it gets to be like for example, you can think about it, your skin in the game. How much would you bet that something is within, like a measurement is within a certain range? How much would you bet that you're going to arrive on time, on a train or something like that? Within what range it's there? And that becomes a kind of a reality sometimes in terms of what uncertainty you can accept in a measurement, say, whatever it happens to be. And typically, what reduces uncertainty? Experience. So the way we reduce uncertainty in a measurement is we do it many, many times. And the more times we can make it, the more we can reduce the uncertainty in the sense of what we know that the mean to be, and then what might be the precision. We'll talk about what the range of that would happen to be. But just purely on the human scale, you could think of uncertainty, and then the sense of you as a human being, what that would be, and how you have experience reduces that uncertainty.
So, Ira, are you going to be sharing screen some more, or can we go back to talking to
Yeah,
each
I think
other?
there's one. There should be some more. Yeah, I
Okay.
can stop it for now, and then come back.
Yeah.
So
So you had just said that experience reduces uncertainty and that there's a range of precision, but the more often that you do the measurement, the closer you can get.
right. I mean, just your uncertainty about anything. You're going to go take a trip to visit me in France one day.
I
If
hope
you've never
so.
been to France, you might have uncertainty about taking a trip. You go to a new country, you keep on taking it, you reduce your uncertainty. In a sense, to me, that's also the case of measurements. The sense of the reliability of your device, the sense of some way. Now, there are other aspects to it. Obviously, that's simplifying a lot of details, but I think that real sense of it comes to human beings again. That's maybe one of my messages here. Keep coming back, getting away from the abstract sense of whatever we're talking about to a human sense. I think you become a better engineer by doing that. But also, I think maybe other people can understand more about what the issues are. So here's another one. We then started talking about, Brad, about 12 minutes about some of the ways that he has different blocks of different sizes to get the range of measurement that will be acceptable, right? In mechanical engineering design, that is called the tolerance.
Mm-hmm.
So, right, as Brad explained very well, every single measurement has some uncertainty. So every single piece can have some uncertainty and not be precision up to some value of what it happens to be. Amazingly close tolerances are possible mechanically, much more than electrically, actually, which is maybe surprising. So, but that tolerance, if we want to think about it, that is the range we can accept for the device to work. If you're out of tolerance, the reason those tolerances were put there, the screw won't hold, the thing will fall down. Something won't work. That's why it has to have within the tolerance. And if you think about tolerance, we deal with things in society with other people. We want to have tolerance, right? For other ways of doing things, other ways of thinking. But there is a sense of beyond some level, it won't work. This is what people argue about what it is. We could talk about things that are here in France. We have, say, a large Muslim community. If they all believed in very strict Sharia law, it would not be coherent with the French tradition, coming from the revolution and afterward, of also a laic society that came, after the Dreyfus affair, in the early part of the 20th century. So tolerance has to be somewhere within the range that, the society will continue to function,
Mm-hmm.
which it is in the mechanical sense. We tolerate this much deviation, otherwise the design won't work. I think there's something that has to be that way to tolerate. We tolerate others up to something, that they're not violent, that they're not, now it's hate speech. Is that the right place? But I think the analogy really holds between understanding what tolerance is mechanically, in a mechanical system with mechanical design, and then what we deal with, in society. So, what do I have here? At 17, we were talking, Brad was talking about, there's my one little correction. He was talking about the width of a thumb, and it's usually actually the length of the thumb. What's that? You can look up some of the, obviously my thumb is not quite an inch, I don't think. And so where that comes,
The
obviously,
length of the length of the first
yeah,
joint.
the length of the part. there. I thought maybe it's this length of the thumb. I have to look at it again.
Well,
Maybe
no, because um, my guess is that this, like every other joint in the body, is roughly the golden ratio. So probably the top of the thumbnail in ratio to the part from the thumbnail to the first joint is the golden ratio, and then this first joint here to the second joint is the golden ratio, and the second joint to the third joint is the golden ratio, because that tends to be the way the body is made. So
well, that could be again where that
it's probably
comes
this
into
part
sense.
right here that's an inch on it, but it would be a man's thumb.
No, I don't think that seems like too much for me. I think it's more like that last digit. But in any case, it's just that's typically, that's what said length versus width.
But it was somebody's thumb. That's the point. It wasn't
Somebody's thumb.
any old
There is
thumb.
the sense of figuring out a standard in between them and how people
Yeah.
did it, building the Gothic cathedrals or the pyramids or whatever else they were doing in terms of having units of measure, though, if they would use those or not. But just the sense, again, I would come back to human bottom-up types of sense of things versus a top-down imposed value, and whatever the standard would be is the thing to.
Well, doesn't it seem as though the measurement system that we have now is a combination of both? Because the bottom up sort of decided what the units of measurement were going to be, but then once you decided what those units of measurement are going to be, you have to have some sort of a standard for how much of a foot and how much.
There is.
How
This
big a
just gets
foot, how
back to
big an
something,
inch.
right, that we can, you brought up later in the conversation, about how, and maybe we could just talk about it now since we're talking about it. I think Brad was making the case of there has to be some kind of imposed standard. And again, I would push back somewhat on that to say they're agreed upon standards. I think he used the example of Wi-Fi. Somebody had to say, this is the Wi-Fi. Again, different Wi-Fis could exist next to each other. Why does one standard become accepted? Well, maybe it's better somehow, not decided by a technocratic committee or some company buying off the technocratic committee. I mean, how often have we seen that every single day imposed upon us?
Yes.
But people see it works better and then decide to use it. I'm going to get this device, this using the Wi-Fi that I know works better. And then, the other people take it on and use it. So
I think one of the reasons that the committee thing pops up in the standards issue is that at a certain point, all the peripheral companies that are making equipment that go with that, they have to make some sort of a decision. Which one of these Wi-Fis are we going to start making our equipment to meet, right? And so then the companies get together and they have a meeting and they say, we have to decide on a standard so that everybody else can start making stuff to fit together with it. The more
again, I don't think
complex
they
it
have
gets.
to decide that. I think people can decide on their own. Somebody can say, I'm going to make a different Wi-Fi.
Well,
And
that's what happened with Apple and PCs in the beginning, because all the software developers were developing for one or the other, and then
I think the problem in the modern world, it's been always so mixed, that we can't see it. I saw something years ago now, so I might remember this wrong, but something like a measurement or something about quality in the diamond trade, which is like dominated by like the Jewish community in Antwerp. It's really kind of strange and wild. But one of the things that came through was if you cheat, you'll never be allowed in the community again. And that's like how the standard of not cheating, which is a little bit different than maybe what we're talking about. And I think this was the sense of, I was referring somewhere, it's in the Bible, certainly about having accurate, weights and standards in terms of making the comparison. And it's enforced by then society shunning you essentially if you don't follow it. I think on the standards of doing it different ways, it just becomes practically, people copy things that work better, if there's not IP protection or something like that. So in today's world, I think it's hard to, to see these things because it's always so mixed up about how things are working, what is really happening in terms of, different people coming up with ideas versus some, I mean, imposing the standards and how they should be done. I would argue, I think I could find lots of examples in different fields where the imposed solution has been really bad for society. I think we're
what
much
would you
better
think?
off with voluntarily accepting a standard.
When you think of the internet, do you think of, how the internet is just all cobbled together? Do you think of that as something where things were imposed from the top, or do you think it got cobbled together from the bottom up, and then now we have what we have?
I think it's, well, it did start out of DARPA, and back in the day, I mean, I was doing stuff for my, my PhD on the DARPA net, and or ARPANET, I think it was called, and sending data to different places and doing things. When the World Wide Web came on, there was a period, it certainly relatively was kind of wide open, and all kinds of different things were coming, and then different, again, standards were developed. Let me give you another one slightly off of that, but to give you an example of how things happen. There's a connection for most kind of, certainly instrumentation devices, like to a computer or digital system, or there was, this is now 25 years ago, called an RS-232 connection. And it was kind of like supposedly a standard, a certain number of wires that could, take the signal from your device and send in the digital signal to your computer. But when you found, when you actually try to hook up devices, and then there was you needed some kind of little software, a driver, to be able to make the connection on your computer. And, each manufacturer of a device would have their driver. And I don't know, how they did it on purpose or what, but it would seem it wasn't a standard that you just plug one in and have a universal driver. Every company had their own thing. And if you didn't have the right driver, it was a really difficult task to make that work. So was there a real standard? I don't know if anybody, committee, has come up with this standard. Almost virtually everybody had a RS-232 connection, but when you try to connect them, they all had their little differences. So in the internet, I think there were all kinds of little differences. And then when it started to consolidate, I don't know if that was voluntarily and people just started doing it, or by then it became a business government connection, which again, we see now how strong that is. But I think it had always been quite, Google wouldn't be there if it wasn't, invested in by the arm of the CIA and whatever, etc. Why did this one necessarily, is it really absolutely the best? Good question. Was DOS operating system the best? You got to be kidding me, out of Microsoft. But they grabbed the market. And even a lot of Apple, Apple had a lot of good things. I don't find it particular. I used to love it at the beginning, 1980s. I don't think so now. I mean, it's stylish, I suppose, but in terms of how things work. So it's a mixture. I would say is if it's really good, people will want to use it. That's why I'm for a bottom-up standard. Say we all agree to do this, as opposed to an imposed one coming from some entity that's not God in the Bible. Say, and again, I'll volunteer. Even that one, though, essentially, if we don't voluntarily take up the standard, I think there's a problem with it, even if it's good. Okay, so let me show you one other little concept that I think is important, and it was part of conversation, and that has to do with this one. So maybe this is not the best, but something like this is just a fundamental part of learning about measurement. And you didn't really get to it with with Brad, I think you're mostly talking about something here, which is precision error range. See? So imagine this is a measurement you're trying to make, and there's a true value somewhere. We believe out there's something real. And you can take a lot of measurements, and this is the uncertainty that I was talking about, and say, after taking these 5 measurements, I can say, well, I'll bet you 20 to 1, my next measurement will be in this range, as a way of giving odds to it or something, talking about my uncertainty. And this uncertainty, by taking enough measurements and using, all those statistical tools that have been developed, we can then quantify that uncertainty, which is really important and helpful. But there's this other thing called bias error. So for example, in one of the examples that Brad was showing you with his caliper, I believe, that he had to set a kind of what's the word? All of a sudden I can't think of it. Set the 0 at the beginning of the measurement each time, maybe, it's a recalibration or something. That's a classic one. You have to calibrate, and then you can see where you're around your precision error, some measurement. But there can always be a bias that you can't anticipate. I took a measurement or I had a technician take some measurements and record them in a book, in a lab notebook. And then I take those measurements and then I put them in my computer and do analysis. And in fact, he writes this technician really was sloppy, and I couldn't read the difference between a 4 and a 9. That's an error in the measurement. That's the measurement I use is the wrong one. And that could come by human error, by not calibration error, all kinds of things. And those aren't really quantifiable because they could come anytime and you don't know they're there. So it's just another aspect to, I think, keep in mind about measurement.
Yeah, I mean, a simple example that I can give is when before I started painting on canvas, I used to do watercolors on paper, which meant that I had to cut a mat to go with each painting and then frame it up. And when you cut a mat, you have to be very precise. Otherwise, part of the edge of the painting is going to show inside the mat, or you're going to cover too much of the painting. So it has to be very precise. But you have to make a decision when you're measuring. Let's see, here's a piece of paper. When I measure, do I measure the outside of the measurement or do I measure the inside of the measurement? And that tiny little difference can make all the difference in the world. So if you don't create a standard for yourself, every time I measure, I'm going to measure on the outside, or every time I measure, I'm going to measure on the inside.
If you take a carpenter, it's like how you draw your line and where you cut on the line. I tell you one that I was a good buddy of mine, really like him a lot. He is a really neat person. And he owned the pub I used to go to, and he also restored old buildings. He was really good. In my town, Easton in Pennsylvania, you see all these old buildings around. And he had a lot to do with doing that with his 2 brothers. Great. So anyway, one time I was with him. He was putting something up really cool at his house, which was along the Delaware River, down toward Bucks County. If you know that part of the world, it's really nice. And he was up on up there putting up on a roof on a garage and making a little space up there. And I was just down there helping him out, having a beer and things like that. So anyway, he showed me like the angle he wanted to cut in the plywood, and he made the I can remember right. He had the place where he wrote the angle down, but he put it in a place where I always would put the angle you want within the angle itself. Because I wrote down the angle, I put it there and even put a little semi arc there and said, this is the angle. And he put it off to the side. And, I was off by, the 180 minus that angle. He wanted the other side,
Oh,
like the obtuse side, and I did the other one. Because again, this is the things that Brad was talking about. They'll come and smack you on the, immediately when you start doing that. You need to have agreement on certain ways of communicating, what you're doing. Otherwise, it just won't work. It is the sense of tolerances and things like that. So, which brings me to another place where you guys went on the conversation, which I think is much harder to talk about because it gets away from the human scale, which I've been, trying to express, in this conversation. So at about 20 minutes, 20 or something, you start talking about the quantum realm. And you've had many discussions, I think, with Glenn and others about this. Let me just bring back just one part of it, and that's, at least right now, and that's the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. And even went and tried to take a look at some of the original aspects of Heisenberg's paper, and it's very elegant and theoretical based on the quantum mechanics. But let me put it the way it always sounded immediately to me, in terms of how to think about it. So if I wanted to take a measurement of the temperature of the ocean, I could take a thermometer and dip it in and take the reading. Now, there's many things that could cause me error in that, precision and bias in taking that measurement. But one of the things that doesn't seem like a problem for me is that the heat level or the energy of the thermometer won't interact with the ocean to change the ocean's temperature. Or maybe it's a little bit like this interaction, not exactly the same, but what Glenn was talking about, but everything I do, I'm interacting with, the observed thing, the observer is interacting with the observed. But at a practical level is what we do all the time is, say, temperature is an easy one to think about. When we put something, say, in contact with what we're going to be measuring, we have something typically much smaller than as the transducer, the measurement point of measurement compared to the thing being measured. And from that, in a practical sense, we feel like we're getting a good enough measurement. Though sometimes that's a real issue. And there we can get a real bias error,
right.
as opposed to a precision. It's something about it'll always be wrong, and we have to know
Well,
what's
if you were
going on.
measuring, for example, if you were measuring temperature in a teacup and you put a thermometer in there, it might affect the measurement, right?
You had your thermometer in the freezer, and then you stuck it in the teacup. One is the thermometer has to go through in time to get to the temperature, some equilibrium temperature, but it's soaking up heat from the tea to make that. It goes on and on.
Yeah.
Going some that. So to me, when you talk about the Heisenberg problem, we're starting to talk about, at least from Heisenberg's, I think, point of view when he was writing this, maybe we could talk about other particles, but the smallest thing. So once you have the smallest thing and I want to measure something about it, what can I use that's smaller than that to be able to get a measurement?
Yeah.
Nothing. That's why, I can know this, and I can know the position, but not the momentum and whatever else is going on. And that's just a simple logic of taking any measurement. How much is what I'm measuring affecting what's there? If I'm measuring the smallest thing, I'm going to be affecting that measurement. And how you're going to affect it, somehow, maybe very elegantly, you can work out that I'll affect it a certain amount, but still the uncertainty is going to go up because of all the uncertainties everywhere. You're measuring at the smallest scale, and that's where you're going to have big problems to be able to measure anything with precision, in an accurate way.
Does the same thing happen when you're trying to measure something at the largest scale?
I think there could be, but it's less of an obvious issue to me. You have other problems of if something's, if I'm trying to measure the distance to the moon with a ruler, there's a lot of measurements that then have to be made that add up uncertainty and error that will, make it maybe larger, for example. I mean, one of the things you learn as a fundamental in designing a system with measurements in it is to choose the scale of the device at the same level as the measurement you think you're going to be taking. So if you're measuring pressure at 100 psi, you don't want a scale that goes. Obviously, you want one at least 100 psi. You don't want one, a pressure gauge that goes to 50 psi, because you won't be able to measure up to 100. But if you pick one that goes to 10,000 psi, all the measurements will be down at the bottom of the scale, and all the measurements, typical, when you ever get any device, you look at it. How is the precision, the error described? Percent of full scale. So if I'm trying to measure 100 psi with a 10,000 psi scale and the error is 1%, the error is basically the same size as the measure I'm trying to make.
Mm-hmm.
So that happens everywhere. Virtually every time what does the engineer do? What do we teach in the class? Okay, here's a measurement. What do you do? I want to take, what kind of device are you going to use? What's the scale? What precision? What's the precision you need? These are the kind of things you have to think about when you're designing a system and you're putting in, your measurements that would then be used in terms of then for, say, a feedback device, where feedback comes and then is operated on by your device to make decisions, in the way, Glenn was
That's a really elegant idea. I mean, years ago, I inherited from my parents, and I don't even know where they got it, but it was a little postal scale. It's a tiny little device. It looks kind of like a compass, and it has you hold on to it at the top, you clip it onto a letter, and you hold it like this, and it'll balance, and it will tell you exactly how much that letter weighs. Back in the day when we had to decide whether to send something by air or by boat, and it was very expensive if you sent it by air, so you need to know if it was less than half an ounce or more than half an ounce. But if I tried to step on a body scale and then weigh myself and then pick up that stamp, right, and see what the difference would be between my body and my body with the stamp, it would be a very inaccurate measurement.
Exactly. So again, our experience, we understand this perfectly, but to me, I don't see much more of where Heisenberg's, literally, I think he was saying, what experiment would I run? With beautiful, elegant mathematics to show it, but how would you measure something that's the smallest thing? That seems to me always there are ways you think you might be able to do it, from a distance, picking up radiation, but even all those, we still have we're all radiating back and forth to each other. There's things that are small enough that we can ignore them on our normal scale of dealing with things, but they're always there. And that's another part of this is, the quantum mechanics, the one thing, and maybe I can show you some, I was watching some Steven Weinberg, which I started following and read a book because I followed some of your conversations. I've had a few books I've read following your channel. But for me is, let me give you another little anecdote. When I was starting work for the company I just finished working with, or still work with a bit, but we were doing experiments, essentially developing models and doing an experiment where the models were to predict where aerosols would deposit in the lung. You could think of that for drug delivery. You could think of that for problems of environmental pollutants and things. Where will it go, and then what follows from that in terms of, say, therapeutic efficacy or for toxicity. And working on, with the team, to develop to do some experiments, really as best, I think still like the best ever done in terms of controlled experiments to then determine where particles went in the lung. And then we image them, with this case was called SPECT, kind of you put a radioactive tracer on there. Plus then we'd also measure with high-res CT, the computer tomography, the lungs, the airways, and then build our models and be able to make a comparison. And I remember the first time we had some preliminary data of the measurement with preliminary data from a model, and we're showing it to our boss, and the boss was upset because, they didn't fall right out each other. She thought it must have been the young scientist there working with me had done the calculations poorly. And, and I said, excuse me, did you think they would fall right on top of each other? There's another one of these questions, that you see just the thinking going and the pause. She said, yes. I said, okay, well, that told me this person didn't understand anything about what we were doing. It was going to be difficult because it's a model. A model, every single model, including quantum mechanics, I'm sorry, is a model. It's not reality. And it's even a statistical model, which, statistical model, that's, if you're doing like studies in biological systems, I can't tell you how hard it is to repeat. There's a whole crisis in repeating something, human psychology, but even you could take cells, genetically exact cells, put them in an environment exactly the same, and you get a range of outputs. And you get statistics, and you see some statistics compared to others to be able to say something about it. So to me, these theoretical physicists, because again, we're in a realm, there's no human scale to this at all. It's totally away from it. And they're telling me their model is perfect. It's more true than anything I could think of. It's the basis of everything, the wave function. That's Weinberg. Okay, that's good for you, Weinberg. I think you're brilliant. I think you write a great book, but I'm sorry, I'm ignoring that kind of idiot advice, because it is idiot advice. And even when I listen to him in some interviews, you get the feeling even he knows it, but he's not going to admit it. It's like the sense with Michael Levin, maybe get him somewhere in the room and say, come on, this is ridiculous. You follow this to the depths of what kind of crazy ideas. So
let me ask you a question in here, because while you were talking, what came to my mind was something that Wolfram said in one of his exploratory conversations that he was having with some of his team. Sometimes they just get together and talk, and they throw out a bunch of weird ideas, and then they try to figure out if
I think I remember seeing you put some of those up there.
Yeah. So in this one, because you just said, now let's say you have, I think you said two identical atoms or two identical.
No, I was talking about, I was involved in many biological experiments.
Oh, two identical cells. You can put them.
You take cells, you take perfect, as far as we know, they're genetically the same.
Right. But I for what I want to talk about, it wouldn't matter if you're talking about two identical atoms or two identical whatever. The conclusion that Wolfram's team came to is that all the particles in the universe have to be unique. They can't be completely identical, because kind of like what that lady said, if they were completely identical, they'd all fall into the same spot. Right? And so the universe would collapse on itself. So every particle, he uses the word eem to represent these his fundamental particles are smaller than Weinberg's fundamental particles. But in his world, those, whether his world is correct or not, I have no idea. But in his world, those all have to be completely unique. And to me, that's a much more elegant and beautiful thought than to think that the world is made up of all these identical particles that could just happen to be in a particular place and just happen to arise up into a glass or a pot or something.
That could be. I think I see your point about, I don't know if elegance is the right word. Certainly the sense of the reality is, to me, is the saying things are exactly the same. Actually, we have to do it to live, in some way. That this chair makes, I can sit on it like another chair, maybe. Even in the sense, I don't want to say this, you go the wrong way, but, that's where maybe racism comes from. People make generalizations that are wrong. And they are wrong in the sense of there's some, in their minds, some statistical, not ever thinking that way, maybe, the likelihood this person will cheat me versus that one, whatever it is, like the most, if you have takes my, the aspect of like, who are the honest, nice people, say Scandinavians. Well, I've watched like a few Scandinavian detective shows. There's some not nice people there. I mean, but you have that thing is that the world is made of you don't need we use groups because we have to, or maybe we're built to, and we have to because of the combinatory exposure in some way. But yeah, but the sense of getting down into Wolfram's theory of the basic of everything versus quantum mechanics of Weinberg, I guess I don't know. I mean, how am I going to know that?
Yeah.
Know that. I mean, okay, you made some observations based on that and it works. I can show you thousands of models that seem to work under certain circumstances and don't work in other ones. Even the great models, my field is fluid mechanics. We have the Navier-Stokes equation. It's a fundamental model. It doesn't even go down to molecules. It says the fluid is a continuum. If we get out of the continuum because there's a shock or a rarefied gas, it doesn't work anymore. And the practitioners, and physicists and engineers, come up with solutions to bridge those places where it doesn't work, to solve problems. But it's a model. It's mathematics. It ain't the reality. It seems to me when I listen to a guy like Weinberg, he's saying the math is more real than the reality. That's the reality, is in the math.
Yeah, well, I know that there are a lot of them that think that. Yeah.
And they follow
I guess
math.
that's one reason I like Wolfgang Smith is he says there is a real world.
Exactly. And that's,
right?
I read one of his books following, your discussions. And, I found it a wonderful, again, when you find somebody who is going much, much more depth into the fundamental concepts than I have about, I've been around some of this stuff, but I admit it. I'm not an expert, far from somebody who understands like all the quantum mechanics. But when somebody tells me their mathematical model is the reality and truth, okay, pal, sure. And he wants to give me billions and billions of dollars to run their experiments. Come on, give me a break, huh? That's the sense to me.
So if he wanted to give you billions and billions of dollars to run his experiment, you wouldn't take it?
Yeah. Well, this is the thing. I was really, I haven't seen him in a long time, but Eric Weinstein, he's just, he's brazen about it. Give the physicists the money. They look at all they've done for them. One is I don't think it's physicists, it's more engineers, but that's another point. But the other thing you say, well, what do really physicists really have the idea to do? Well, atomic bombs, they gave us that. They deserve all the money we could give them.
If you're looking for some more Eric Weinstein to watch, he just did a conversation with Brian Keating on Into the Impossible.
Yeah, I saw a lot of them together.
Yeah,
it's been a while since I've watched.
He just did this one, and mainly he's talking about war, which I didn't listen to the whole thing because I'm much more interested in science than I am in war. So
yeah, so let's see. I think it's going. Let me try to skip a couple of these because we're going a little bit slowly. Um, if you've covered that, you in about 24-minute mark, you start to get into epistemology. And I think, that really is just so fundamental today, and clearly in the conversation I had with Brad, it started with how do you know a measurement is correct, which is important. But now we have it in so much about what our life's about. And I don't know about you, but it seems everybody I know goes through something of, we have this fundamental epistemological problem of what's going on in the world, because people are telling us very different views of what the world is. And we're not there to see it. We're not there to really see what's going on in Ukraine, or we're not in Wuhan, or we're not in Washington on January 6th. I mean, all kinds of things. And we're getting somebody telling us something. This is true. And again, one of the ways you can know people today is where are they getting their information? Are they watching CNN, or are they watching Fox News, or are they watching Karen on the Meaning Code? And
because I don't watch any news.
Well, this is the sense. I mean, and I think that's a real sense of trying to know what's true today, in all these kind of senses. I think that's getting maybe farther away from what you've dealt with on the channel, but there is a sense of consciousness and, what exactly you're taking in, how you're making rational decisions or not. And now, you have things like these, Matthias Desmet, I don't know if you've heard of him, this theory of mass formation psychology and things of the people are how they're taking information, how they're reacting to it based on anxiety, because, they don't have an anchor to say what's real. And so if you think of that in that human scale, what can we have as our anchor to say what's real? Well, I would say about you, I think for me is, say, Christian truths. Again, still have some precision to work out there between us and others, but there is something that's much more solid than what's been growing in the modern world. And what do you do with that? I've been talking with my wife a lot. We have a 14-year-old daughter, and say, okay, you say, give them all the choices they want, and they don't know how to choose. How anxious can you get? This anxiety. What am I going to choose? So I think it's a huge subject. There are aspects of that aspect of having some base to start from, say, Christianity. There's also a fundamental sense of methods. So anytime, for certainly in a scientific paper and these medical papers, told me to talk about, and all the conflicting ones, coffee will kill you, coffee will make you live longer. We can go on virtually, it seems like everything, let alone the controversial stuff nowadays we have about COVID or everything else. But one way you can pick out an expert is, they'll show you the abstract, not so much. They'll show you the results, maybe the discussion, not so much. It's the guy who's going to go there and really dissect methods. If they aren't showing you the methods and explaining why the methods are good and bad, because there are always limitations to the methods. I mean, always. It's like our uncertainty of the measurement. To me, it's almost a phrase, I would say, these data, we know something because of these data, these data suggest this understanding. Suggest, up till now, with its uncertainties, its limitations, that certainly seems something that I'll act on in a particular way. Otherwise, I would doubt whatever, doesn't matter the length of their white coat or how many letters after their name. That's when they're not really getting to you to know what's the really happening.
Well, I mean, that goes back to the thing I quoted at the very beginning that Jordan Peterson said.
Yeah,
When you impose a final order on anything, you
yeah,
lose your connection to the transcendent. So if they say that their method is foolproof, then there's absolutely no way it can align with truth.
yeah. It's just not. There's nothing we know of is a foolproof. Um, Going on about 35-minute mark, you guys you were going back and forth the difference between analog scale and digital, and where digital was taken to be binary. And I would say that's not quite correct, because always we use in digital, and that you can see the digital colors that you can have from on your computer.
Mm-hmm.
They can span something far from binary. And what we have is we have those on-offs, but instead of a continuum, which the true analog is, we have something that is a number of binary steps, but that for our perception becomes essentially like a continuum. And so a classic thing we do all the time in instrumentation, you'd see like the calipers Brad showed you, like all the calipers I've ever, used for decades, there was a scale and you read it like a ruler. Well, he showed you one with the digital scale, the numbers were there. And so what he needed to do, actually probably was inside there, was something like the first device he showed, that the position of a plunger that's being moved is converted to the electrical signal, which is converted to a digital signal. And then that digital signal can be broken up into a number of pieces. And that's like done by an analog. That whole process is from an analog to a digital converter. And it's all like base 2. So you typically would have plus or minus, like the signal is calibrated to, say, the position goes between 0 and 1 inch. It goes between 0 and 10 volts, say. And then you could break that up into 512 pieces, 1,024 pieces, 2,048 pieces, 4,096 pieces. And that's what your output will be in terms of what bin it is, to say that's what the voltage was, which that's what the position was. But so it's not pure binary.
Mm-hmm.
I think think of digital music. I mean, it's not just binary. Those binary bits can be built up to make something that seems to us quite almost like analog, quite smooth.
Well, okay. I think I get what you're saying, but at the end of the day, can every one of those positions be described with a binary?
No. So you hadn't have the uncertainty between the bits. And the classic thing you can look at, if you're looking at your scale that says you have, say, 10 ounces of flour in your bowl, it's actually like 9.5 to 10.5. That's just reading the numbered part. If you go back into this, that gets into, and again, one of the fundamental things, to what precision can that measurement possibly be made? Forgetting the biases, and you can have higher precision problems with this, but the best you could do is only up to how much you can break up that smooth analog scale into the little bits.
Well, so this morning I was watching something on PBS, not on the TV show, but on the guy that talks about physics it's called PBS on YouTube. And he was talking about 1 over 137. And in the process of talking about that, he was showing all the colors that arise when they do a spectroscopy of particular elements.
Yeah.
And originally they thought that each one of those colors was just one line on the spectroscope. But then they finally realized, no, each one of those lines is actually something between two lines. And that distance between those two lines is somehow related to this 1 over 137. So many things are related to 1 over 137. But I think that's what you're talking about, is that even when we take the very finest measurement that we can take, it's always actually something that's in between two numbers, not the
Well,
thing itself.
potentially, actually, it was the you guys were really homing in on the difference between analog and digital, where you took digital as a binary.
Mm-hmm.
And I would just say there is a binary aspect to it. The bit in the computer is up or down. In
Mm-hmm.
this analog to digital converter, it's up or down. But because we can build together lots of binaries, we can have something that seems very analog to us.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm not getting into very deep, profound philosophical or technical sense.
Yeah.
Just
Okay.
you know, that's
Okay.
that's the way it is. Again, look
So
at your
what you're
computer.
saying
Your
is that
computer's a
even with the
digital device,
binary, we can build something that looks analog.
right? And this
Okay.
is again, this has been done all over the. That's
Mm-hmm.
my you know fluid mechanics in a sense. We assume a continuum. It's not always necessarily the case. I'm looking at you on the computer screen, and I see all kinds of different colors. Various reds and blues. Your paintings. Those are coming through to me through a digital device. That seems analog, but it's every single one of those is a kind of thing.
Yeah.
And when you get down to digital data, you can see that. Like, when you were trying to measure the difference, say, between, and these differences might be, say, 0.01 volt or something, and you're trying to measure something that's like 0.8 volts or 0.08 volts, and you'll see the little stair stepping and the data, the device going between two values, two levels, and you see it going ding 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 because that's the binary part.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I mean, phrases like this music's been digitally remastered. It's digital and it still certainly seems analog to you, to your ear, and that was the point I was trying to make. Another thing you guys talked about a lot about minute 40 was something about staying in the middle, and it just really rang to me as the old golden mean. You didn't mention Aristotle, but that was, I thought, one of his fundamental the philosophy, and I think but it's all over the sense of a golden mean in most cases, as something certainly you guys were talking about justice and mercy, and when each should be applied. And boy, that's a tough one. Any parent knows the justice or mercy question is tough.
Yeah.
When you get that right.
I think that's kind of the same question that they always talk about in marriage. People who've never been married say, well, each person should give 50%. But if each person gives 50%, you only have a 50% marriage. That's all you have, right? Each person has to give 100% or maybe 110%. And then you end up with a 100% marriage. And maybe justice and mercy work that way as well. But it's the merciful application of justice and the just application of mercy.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's the sense of, I think you were getting at, it's any justice applied is with love. It's getting, what's the end that you have in mind? Obviously there's a psychopath that applies justice just to see the pain in the other person.
Mm-hmm.
That hurts to see the pain in the other person. It's to get them to a place that's better for them.
Mm-hmm.
And it's obviously the same for mercy. Say, well, you have some more candy. Have more candy. And at the end, it's not good. So it's certainly, and again, the lessons there are from Jesus, the Bible. You can find them there, the right kind of answers. I think not the answer, but the guide.
Mm-hmm.
Of what you should be thinking about. In terms
Mm-hmm.
of that, and probably from other places too. But another place, I think about minute 42, you were talking about manufacturing history. I think Brad was talking about maybe between the different manufacturers of trucks and other things there. I think we've already talked about this, is that sense of, from my point of view, is setting the standard from above. Kind of the administrative state is not historically necessarily at all what has happened, but also that's also not necessarily a good way to think about solving those issues. We certainly have a problem when we want to interchange. No, it's the problem with language. The Académie Française sets the French language. In English, we don't have anybody setting it, but hopefully we get to the point, we're communicating, or maybe we're having a problem now. We have an administrative say, start to tell us this is what the words mean, as opposed to letting people communicate, and it becomes a standard in various ways. Voluntarily, people write dictionaries, say, oh, this is what this word means. But anyway, I think for me, from a fundamental understanding and historically, I'm much more prone to want to see the bottom up, that's maybe guided, but in a voluntary sense from the top. Certainly it'll be people suggesting a standard, and then people to come to it voluntarily. Let's see.
I want to throw in one little thing here that I heard Jordan Peterson say today that just rang a bell for me. He used the word point in What's the Point as being not only what we are striving for, but something that's calling us forward. And I thought, well, that's a beautiful picture of the bottom up thing, that when something is happening from the bottom up, but the people who are involved in that bottom up work have a point to what they're doing, that point is simultaneously the top down of all. The bottom up is striving towards a point, and that point is the top down that's working with the bottom up.
Yeah, I think Jesus gives an example we strive for, but again, it's not the administrative state. It's the example that we could point to. And certainly that's a top down.
When you say, what's the point? Why am I doing this? Well, I'm doing this because this is what Jesus calls me to do, or this is what Jesus would have done. And that's the point. That's the meaning of it. And that has a top-down power to it, working with the bottom.
Another kind of, I think we've touched on a lot of other comments I've had for a while, and I'm about 1 hour in. And I have, my note is, the truth is not measured. And I can't remember exactly what the discussion was at that point. But I think the sense of, again, going back to the whole measurement question, and we touched on this earlier, measuring anything human is a disaster, quantitatively. So, there's lots of issues about, say, with mental illness. There was something called the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. I think it's now DSM-5, maybe it's 6. Mm-hmm. When I was studying this issue, it was like DSM-4. So it's the idea is, how do you know somebody is mentally ill? And they have a set of questions they would ask and give some kind of either yes, no, or value. But then correlating all those together, you get some kind of quantitative measure that then would give the diagnosis. And this is just useless for many, many reasons. Mm-hmm. You could also, more people might know about something like, measuring teaching. I'm used to, from in the university, our teaching evaluations. And this was always gamed. Actually, any statistic you can see is always gamed. Crime statistics are gamed. Look at COVID. Like every statistic was gamed in many, many, many ways. And so, and you could again go back to Brad's point about, there's uncertainty in every measurement. So what do we know is true? And then from the other side, it said there is truth in the world. There's things like the airplane works. We go many times from point A to point B. But there's also things I think we could know from a more logical standpoint as being true. And this would say it's kind of economics from the Austrian school with Mises and that role of say the law of diminishing returns. We have less value in something that is abundant than if it's rare. If I have one refrigerator, I value it. By my 100th refrigerator, it's not so valuable to me. I wouldn't care about it. If take an absurd example, but that sense is something that I think is true. And then you could say something about the world from that truth, but you can't measure it. You can't say the 100th refrigerator is worth 1/100th of the first one. It's nothing at all like that. And we can't predict it. We can't look historically. Mises in his day he had huge academic battles against what he called the German historical school. The idea is we'll take all the data, and once we have all the data, we'll then be able to go and predict the next thing. No, that's not the way the world works. The quantification, looking back, is not it. But we can be able to have a sense of things by these sort of fundamental axioms. And I would say that goes for something like morals. I would say a totally horrible idea is like utilitarian theory, where you can quantify and make a calculus of comparing, this happiness to that happiness. I think, sometimes, it's, and you see how, I think one time you were talking about, the problem with a streetcar, should I sacrifice this life for that one? Or, the horrible things like Madeleine Albright, she said, you killed 500,000 children. And she said, it's worth it. It's a great, it's played over and over again, probably Al-Qaeda TV sets, kind of thing. She tried to take that back, but this is what those people say. They're making some calculus about doing horrible things. Oh, it's worth it. But you can't ever do that. So you have to come back to other fundamental ways of, I think, making moral decisions and on natural law. It can't be quantified.
And I think part of the reason that is so is that Peterson was talking to Peter Kreeft the other day, and they were talking about, religious truth and Christian truth, and Peterson made some comment about how the world is combinatorially explosive because of the perspective that is imposed by humans on potential. And Kreeft said, well, I wouldn't want to use that word imposed. He said, I would prefer to use the word add. And if you stop and think about that for a while, it really starts to filter out in some very interesting ways that humanity adds. So you can have the very predictable world of rocks and sand and physics, but humanity adds this extra element that's unpredictable and unmeasurable, and that's what makes the beauty of the beauty and the disaster.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things, I guess, just to maybe be finishing up, that sense of one aspect of reason the mistakes are made is, it's reduced to something that's one, two variables when everything's always multivariable, almost incomprehensibly. So we can't figure it out so simply. And the solution to that is, making decisions again through love. This coming from, I think the natural law is basically saying this. I think Jesus was saying this. That's the solution to the human problem. Because we're going to make decisions that are wrong. They won't work. Often, we have a situation where we make a decision, it doesn't work, and you can blame yourself for it, but there was no decision that would work. But if you're making your decision through love the best you can, then when it doesn't work, you can live with that. So that's the sense of so much of the things, again, the quantitative idea or the AI decision, as opposed to this human level, human scale. Come back to the beginning of the conversation. I think that, to me, is where one of the ways we're going off the wrong way in our modern civilization. And getting back to that human scale, human decision making is through love, with all the problems of decision making that, again, some of your discussions about, what's a real decision, what are the things affecting us, what's the practice that we need in a Vervaekeal sense to get to the point where the decision making, it's, if I'm like in agape sense, I really want to make the decision best for that other person. It's not anything, as best I can do it. Anybody could do, but that's what you're looking. That's the point, the ideal you're trying for. Then the output, the output is good, in my sense. It's when we try to, make something that only works in a quantitative sense, for sure, we have real problems, and it's etc. And it gets down to all kinds of detail. Those were some of the things. My notes aren't always so good. My handwriting's not good. I look at my daughter, like she, in France, they spend like years practicing writing their the physical act of making your notes, and the notes are always checked. And if you see that, the notes are just beautiful.
I wish somebody had taught me that when I was young. I mean,
mine are all over the place.
I was taught penmanship.
Penmanship, that's what I mean. Penmanship and then the notes. Yeah. So,
nobody ever taught me how to take notes. That would have been great.
but the sense of it is, anyway, I think I'm back to the end of my comments, and so. But anyway, that was the sense. I thank you and for all your conversation, especially Brad. I enjoyed it very much and thought it was really worthwhile to go over those things, and for him to come to the question from this real world sense of things work and they don't work, that he's got his idea of what measurements are. Mm-hmm. And then they made me think, expanding it. And so anyway, I always enjoyed talking to you, and we'll see how it goes.
Well, I think this has been fascinating. It's so interesting to see how many different ways that you were able to spring off of what we talked about. And I think it's going to be a great conversation. So,
well, I hope so.
Thank you for bringing it up.
I admit my doubts about whether this will make the rank of now the meaning code of Hall of Fame, because it's
yes, it made the ranks.
Got too many top people on there now, Karen. That's
have a great week.
Bye-bye.
It's been great talking to you.